I have to say thank you to Jane because she explained everything I don't have time to explain here, so that's great. Records and other archival materials, such as research data, are more likely to be conceived of and thus described as bureaucratic instruments and primary sources for scholarly use than in terms of the central and instrumental role they can play in the lives, needs, and emotions of individuals, families, and communities to whom they pertain. Much of the capacity of these materials to effect and record actions and to inspire affect is integrally bound up with the metadata associated with them. And by metadata, what I mean are all or any of the various traces, statements, and surrogates that are made by or about the materials, and their various structures and contexts over time, including archival description. And in the archival field, we tend to refer to those nowadays as record-keeping metadata. However, the metadata generated by creators of these materials and the descriptive practices subsequently employed by government, academic, and other mainstream archival repositories that preserve the materials rarely directly or adequately address the concerns and needs of other such parties within the relevant community of records. The emergent archival concept of co-creatorship addresses concerns of equity and ethics in contemporary archival description and metadata more broadly, but at the same time challenges traditional ideas about provenance, which is the primary principle, as Jane has explained, that's applied in archival arrangement and description. Drawing upon a study of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Archive, or ATSIDA, which is a digital archive that is structured and maintained according to a set of protocols developed in consultation with Indigenous community representatives, my paper today contemplates a range of metadata concerns relating to co-creators, that is, those who were involved with the creation of the record as contributors, subjects, victims, or legatees, rather than as officially acknowledged authors. It also discusses the role that community protocols might play in promoting underrepresented community needs, interests, and beliefs in archival description, and raises the question of how archival description might cope with a plurality of such communities needing additional representation. So I'm going to start first with doing a bit of theoretical framing of this discussion. Recent critical discourse in archival studies has been trained on issues of representation, equity, and ethical imperatives associated with the concept, societal role, and practices of the archive. Three distinct strands have focused on the implications of power and representation for historically subjugated, marginalized, or subaltern communities. These three are post-colonial analyses of the role of the archive and archival practices in colonization, the community archives movement, and the movement to promote Indigenous protocols for archival materials, which is the one I'm going to talk about today. Each strand is deeply cognizant of the often difficult and intertwined histories that are inevitably reflected in the equally intertwined archival materials that are their residue. At the same time, each strand raises its own questions about how mainstream archival description reflects and shapes interpretations of these materials in favor of dominant or elite interests, and often in the process subordinates or excludes the narratives, needs, and perspectives of communities who were underempowered, unwitting, or unwilling participants in the creation of documentation about them. Institutional consultation or partnerships with these communities and community self-determination over their own materials have been proposed in these discourses as ways to acknowledge and include marginalized and excluded voices. Archival description that directly addresses community needs and perspectives, however, must go beyond enhancing access to these communities to collections and items that are held by individual repositories. It must also be able to traverse, explain, set the record straight, and reconcile several types of metadata for multiple kinds of materials by and about those communities that today might be dispersed across many locations and repositories, and have been created over time under different political and social circumstances and according to different worldviews. There are, and Jane has alluded to some of this already, but there are several goals of archival descriptive standards and best practices, and they're not necessarily the same as they are in the other information fields. They include the elucidation of the circumstances of creation and creative intent behind the materials being described, exposing their documentary interrelationships, which is sometimes referred to as their archival bond, supporting user assessment of their reliability and continued authenticity, and of course promoting findability. There are many complexities inherent in describing archival evidence and information in ways that can cope with variant worldviews and shifting terminology and conceptualizations, and ascribing different meaning and value that might occur over the lifetime of the preserved materials. Moreover, professional best practices, and Jane alluded to this as well, have yet to grapple significantly with such ethical and human rights considerations as integrating community protocols, undertaking community-centric redescription, or what we call reconciling legacy metadata. And by reconciling here, we mean in the same vein as truth and reconciliation commissions. Provenance, the primary organizing principle underlying physical and intellectual access to archival materials, paradigmatically recognizes only the author, either juridical or human, the collector or the donor, as the possible creators of archival materials. The act of designating provenance is an acknowledgement of the authority and responsibility, and by implication, reinforces the power status of the creating entity. Other parties involved in the creation of the materials, if mentioned at all, are treated as subjects or objects of those materials, and may not necessarily even be acknowledged through additional descriptive access points, such as added entries. Expanded conceptualizations of provenance have been proposed to address records or other materials of archival value that are generated by digital collaborations or collectively by communities. They include functional provenance, ethnicity as provenance, and Hurley's simultaneous multiple provenance and parallel provenance. One emergent approach that integrates Hurley's ideas with rights assertions regarding indigenous knowledge that are contained in the 2007 UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights is to recognize other parties to the creation of the records as co-creators who have rights in their records. Among those are the right to be acknowledged as a co-creator, and to ensure, through self-determination or consultation, that archival description reflects their perspectives, experiences, expressions, and ways of knowing. Co-creatorship and the associated matrix of rights and obligations is one of a cluster of conceptually related constructs emerging from recent archival theory building and applied research that have implications for archival description and the expansion of the conceptualization of provenance. And I'm just going to mention a few of these right now. A community of records acknowledges the web of relationships between actions, records, and record-keeping traditions, practices, and conventions within one particular community of memory, and a lot of that is done through metadata. The collective identity of a community of memory is linked to a community recognizing itself through its memory of a common past, and involves an embeddedness to its past and consequently to the memory texts in any form through which that past is mediated. And that's a quote from Eric Kettelard. And archival reconciliation is an approach developed through Indigenous research partnerships in Australia that involves the acknowledgement of the impact of past and existing record keeping and archival structures and practices, and situating current and future structures and practices within the archival multiverse. The latter, the archival multiverse, encompassing the plurality of evidentiary texts, meaning records in multiple forms and cultural contexts, memory-keeping practices and institutions, bureaucratic and personal motivations, community perspectives and needs, and cultural and legal constructs. So that there's a very large cluster of ideas that are now emerging in the archival field with tremendous relevance for doing this kind of work in description. The Metadata Archaeology project, which I conducted between 2010 and 2012, used discourse analysis, ethnography, and autoethnography to examine metadata considerations in various archival contexts, what aspects of the above-mentioned discursive strands could be observed in action, and to explore issues of incommensurability and intersectionality that might arise. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of these, which was the ATSEDA study that I did. And in doing that, I'd also, as Anne did, like to acknowledge my Indigenous colleagues that I worked with in Australia. In 1995, the Australian Library and Information Association published the first edition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Library and Information Resources Network, it's known as ATSILEARN, Protocols for Libraries, Archives and Information Services. A key philosophy underlying the ATSILEARN protocols is a both ways or two ways approach that is based upon equal respect for both Indigenous and Western languages, knowledge and learning approaches. The ATSILEARN protocols recognize the moral rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the owners of their knowledge and the importance of their involvement in deciding issues arising from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content and perspectives in documentary materials, media, and traditional cultural property. They also encourage Indigenous participation in the governance and operation of libraries, archives, and information services. The ATSILEARN protocols influenced the development of similar protocols addressing Native American concerns about archives and archival practices that was published in the United States in 2007 and have been a subject of tremendous debate within the archival profession. They also influenced the philosophy, structure, and activities of ATSEDA. 5 minutes. I got 10 minutes on my computer here. As the ATSILEARN protocols point out, among the many perspectives present in Australian library and archival materials relating to the Indigenous population are those of the colonist, policeman, and magistrate, as well as those of the historian, anthropologist, and social commentator. The perspectives that are notably absent, however, are those of Indigenous peoples themselves. Bringing them home, the 1997 report of the National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families highlighted the historical roles that bureaucratic record-keeping and metadata played in the identification, forcible removal from their families and communities, and assimilation of Australian Indigenous children between 1869 and the 1970s. Records from this period routinely applied the official bureaucratic terminology of those carrying out the programs and activities associated with the removals, and used English names and designations to refer to Indigenous country, locations, communities, and individuals. Both bureaucratic records and materials gathered or created by anthropologists, naturalists, and private collectors from or about Indigenous communities, or individuals during this time, could include intimate and often derogatory information about Indigenous people, or record language, stories, songs, and other elements that are considered secret or sacred by Indigenous people. While the structures, categorization, and language used in describing these records and other materials are evidence of colonial, bureaucratic, and scholarly attitudes and activities of the time, they remain far from benign in terms of both their historical and continuing effect and the affect on Indigenous individuals, families, and communities. The report also focused on the ways in which archives today might support redress to those who had been removed and the inclusion of their lives, experiences, and voices within the national memory. It pointed out that Indigenous family history research, using what bureaucratic records remain in existence, is key to certifying descent from the Indigenous peoples of Australia and acceptance as Indigenous by the Indigenous community. However, the report identified several barriers to using those records for such purposes. For example, they were not easy to use in the way that Indigenous community members needed to use them, because records were described according to provenance, that is, the agency, program, or individual responsible, and there was no consolidated name index. Moreover, references to individuals, often idiosyncratically spelled, or ambiguously or unclearly designated, were scattered through the surviving records of many different agencies, including government offices, schools, and healthcare providers. The report called for the description of these materials in ways that would assist Indigenous persons in their quests, while protecting their privacy and guarding against any future compilations of dossiers about them. In effect, it was asking not only for more complete representation of the past that was inadequately captured in official records, but also for something new and ethically, theoretically, and practically challenging for those holding records: the creation of alternate descriptions that directly addressed Indigenous community worldviews, concerns, and needs. And ACIDA represents one of many, or several archival initiatives that have addressed the concerns. ACIDA is a multi-site data archive hosted by a network of Australian universities that is also a digital keeping place for materials of a diversity of provenances relating to Australian Indigenous people. Initiated in 2010 and including both Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, its content includes extracts of official records such as Indigenous censuses and police reports, as well as opinion polls and surveys, digital versions of genealogies, stories, songs, oral histories, and other expressions of Indigenous knowledge, memory, and ritual. It's exemplary not only because of its data archive approach, but also because its ethos derives from a set of protocols that were developed in association with a reference group composed of senior Indigenous Australian academics and researchers on Indigenous issues. Community consultation, the building of mutual trust, negotiating and reconciling various rights and interests, and professional commitment to these processes thus lie at the heart of ACIDA. I think I'm going to just jump ahead to my conclusion because I know you want me to finish up. But rather than saying more about ACIDA, and I do have a paper here that says all of that, I just want to say a few things. One is that simultaneously representing the interests and perspectives of multiple creator communities equitably, respectfully, and systematically is complex. Even in the case of ACIDA, which has two primary audiences, Indigenous communities and academic researchers, each audience can have considerable internal diversity, being made up of multiple communities. Moreover, communities of all types are dynamic and maybe non-exclusive. They may share some characteristics and perspectives, but not others, and their composition, nature, and needs continually evolve. Description that is responsive to the needs, epistemologies, and practices of communities through working agreements such as protocols is going to have to be nimble enough to address such diversity and dynamism. In the United States, members of the archival profession have expressed concerns that endorsing a protocols-based approach will open the door to non-Indigenous communities and groups that have suffered historical injustices and inequities to seek input in the management of records relating to them, among other measures, perhaps the creation of community-specific metadata. There is also concern that endorsement of the Native American protocols would privilege one group of peoples above all others, that the pasts and legacies of the different Indigenous, migrant, immigrant, and slave populations of the United States are too intertwined to address separately, and that if each group or community needed to be addressed through similar protocols, archives with holdings relating to multiple communities might see their descriptive systems descend into chaos. These concerns highlight the importance of further research and development in this area. If indeed the archival profession were to act more proactively to address social justice issues, should it address the needs and exigencies of each of these communities individually using a protocols-based approach? Should it be done on an institution-by-institution and case-by-case basis? Or should the entire archival paradigm be re-examined to identify more holistic and systematic ways in which it could be more supportive of the different co-creators and communities of records and communities of memory that make up the archival multiverse? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. So we have a few minutes for questions, discussion, and responses. And we'll handle the others. Questions?
I have a question for Jane. Does EAD help bridge that gap between two different types of descriptions, or EAD is the archival description in this case as well?
The answer is no.
Okay.
It's because EAD, I didn't mention that EAD actually exactly the version with the access principle.
Okay.
It's just the digital version. That actually, a lot of examples I found is they use EAD as binding aids framework. So use that as to describe the digital artifacts.
Right. But there's no room in EAD for all the other type of description.
When you upload, when we have the contents online, do you distinguish between, the costing? Do you think there are the same ethical implications if we have objects in our own server or in the cloud? Let's say somebody providing a service for us.
For digital libraries or what?
If we are using a third party or if we're using our own server.
I think the ethical implications are the same in either case. So yeah, I think where it's hosted doesn't matter as much. Yeah.
So do you think we can demand the same privacy to the public, to the private corporations providing service? That was my question.
I don't know. I guess it would depend on the nature of that relationship with that private company or what you're asking them to do. If they're working for you in some way to host a digital library or some set of objects that presumably you would have control over that. But yeah.
Any question? Sorry, yes, please.
I have a question for you. Are you as concerned with identifying individuals in older materials versus newer materials? And in the work that I do, I find myself to be less concerned, but should the ethical implications the same?
It's a good question, and I think most digital libraries deal with historical collections, so it's not as much of a concern. I'm guessing that's why this issue hasn't come up. But dealing with more modern collections, it is, people who are, you're going to Google their name, and it'll show a video of them with huge glasses that they were there 20 years ago. So it's more immediate, but I think that the ethical consideration is the same. People may have the estates of people who pass on, may still have a problem with that. Because I guess the older material, then maybe the more free you can be with objects online. Yeah.
Question. So when we imagine sort of the archetypes or the prototypes of different forms of record-keeping metadata, right? So we understand what an archival description might look like in a hierarchical mark, readout, or whatever else. Are you thinking what sort of structures might facilitate this idea of recognizing co-creator and storytelling in that context?
Well, I think, I didn't talk about arrangement at all, and Jane talked about arrangement, but I think that actually arrangement is probably no longer a relevant paradigm. It's one that one can describe, but not necessarily honour, and particularly when you move into the digital world. But I think a lot of it is about the power issues that underlie description rather than the implementation issues. And until the power issues are worked through, and I was very interested in that paper before, because a lot of the ideas are still Western ideas that are determining notions of privacy, and they're Western legal systems as well. And we have to start to look at what it means to have multiple and sometimes reconcilable and sometimes competing epistemological approaches. But the argument is that one place to start is to think about what the meaning of creation is and what the meaning of ownership is. And there's actually a cluster of other epistemological differences as well, like notions of time and temporality, notions of things that cannot be owned as well. And they start to come, in the archival world, those things start to come head to head really fast. So until you've dealt with them conceptually, and this is why critical theory gives you a tool to start to do this, it's very hard to start to look at them. And I'm a technical implementation person too, so to look at how you then start to implement all of that. And I was very interested in earlier talking about methodological approaches too, because as somebody who does not belong to this community, to try to figure some of these things out and talk about them is incredibly difficult, which is why having started with the discourse analysis approach, which I thought would keep me back, that developed to ethnography and from there to also ethnography, because there was an ethical requirement to keep placing yourself into the middle of this. And that's, I think that's something else that we have to grapple with a lot more.
Other questions, responses, connections? All right, with that, I want to thank all three of the presenters.